Good morning. My name is Ryan Evans, and I'm the Executive Director at Chambers for Innovation in Clean Energy. Chambers for Innovation in Clean Energy is an organization that works with chambers of commerce and economic development organizations across the country to advance the clean energy economy. We focus on promoting good clean energy policy and programs and look forward to amplifying the economic opportunities associated with clean energy. Our nationwide network represents more than 1,300 chambers of commerce and economic development organizations. Founded and led by chamber executives, CICE works with these associations throughout the US, including very large member associations and the smallest, those in red and blue states, as well as urban and rural communities. Thank you for joining us. And on behalf of our co-hosts, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, the multi-billion-dollar Florida electric vehicle industry and its benefits for Florida businesses. Why are we here to talk about electric vehicles? Personally, I think it has become pretty obvious that the writing is now officially on the wall that the global auto manufacturing industry is undergoing a rapid transition from the traditional internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. In the US alone, we have just seen some very impressive commitments from major players in the auto industry, including General Motors, that they will only produce EVs after 2035. Ford has said that they will double their EV investment, and the US government is fully committed to the full transition of its fleet to EVs. The transition to electric vehicles is an important discussion for chambers of commerce, the US business community, and our federal government for a number of reasons. Clearly, it is a cleaner form of transportation that benefits our society in many, many ways. Second, the cost of ownership is significantly lower. Not only does it cost less to fuel an electric vehicle, but it is a lot less costly in terms of maintenance. Think about what that means for commercial fleets of dozens, hundreds, or thousands of vehicles. Third, we have an opportunity to create tens of thousands of jobs across the country, not only in manufacturing of EVs and batteries, but most significantly in the deployment of EV charging infrastructure. Fourth, if our country ever wants to be truly energy independent, we must eliminate our need for foreign oil. EVs are a powerful tool in seeing that become a reality. Fifth, well, in my nearly 20 years of working in chambers of commerce, I have never met a chamber of commerce that did not like to talk transportation because of its importance for economic development opportunities in a particular region. And why Florida? Florida's number 2 in the nation for overall passenger EV sales. And state officials have cited figures projecting there could be as many as 4.5 million electric vehicles on the Florida roads by 2030, a huge leap from the estimated 69,000 or so that are currently registered in the state of Florida. There is clearly an opportunity for economic growth via the EV industry for this state, especially in relation to creating a robust charging network and EV infrastructure. With that being said, we have several people scheduled to speak with you today, so I'd like to wrap up my time and you can hear from them, the experts. In our meeting today, we will hear from Ardith Prendergast, Vice President of Operations and Business Retention and Expansion for the Citrus County Chamber of Commerce, Dory Larson, Electric Transportation Program Manager, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, Stan Cross, Electric Transportation Policy Director, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and Matt Alford, Executive Director of Drive Electric Florida. I'd also like to thank our partners today. These organizations work diligently to help Florida communities, residents, and businesses realize the economic opportunities from clean energy and rapid growth of the EV industry. I'd like to thank Drive Electric Florida and the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy for their partnership in developing business and economic focused content for this webinar. I would also like to say a special thank you to the CICE team coordinating presentations today, most notably Darren Cheatham, our Florida Policy and Engagement Lead, and Feldhusen, our State Lead for Florida, and Jessica Bergman, who is our behind the scenes administrator of the webinar and our New England Programs and Engagement Director. Now for just a little bit of housekeeping before I turn the time over to our presenters. Approximately 40 people have registered for today's webinar, and as attendees, presenters will not hear or see you. In order to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom menu. Presenters and the host will see your questions, but other attendees will not. We will be monitoring that section for questions and will address them at the end of the webinar. The webinar is being recorded for possible use in the future. I would now like to turn the time over to Ardith Prendergrass, Vice President of Operations and Business Retention and Expansion for the Citrus County Chamber of Commerce. Ardith?
Yes, good morning. And first of all, I want to say thank you so much to CICE for inviting me to be a part of this, and also to Darren, who discovered what the Citrus County Chamber of Commerce has been doing. I had a nice conversation with Darren, and he said he discovered that our chamber is a location where Duke Energy has recently put in 4 charging stations, and we are very pleased to have those. They actually kind of fell into our laps. A few years ago, one of our state senators, Senator Brandis, who is in the Hillsborough area, who has an EV, commented that as he's trying to drive from Hillsborough up to Tallahassee for legislative sessions, that it was very difficult for him to take his EV because there were so few places where he could stop to charge the car. And it would really be handy if there was one in Citrus County, which is about, 50 miles north of Tampa, 180 miles from Tallahassee. So we have a nice partnership with Duke Energy, and they actually reached out to us and suggested that we'd be a great location for a charging station. We are right on US 19. The Citrus County Chamber of Commerce is very focused on clean energy and protecting our nature coast. After all, we are known as the nature coast of Florida. So when this opportunity came up, we jumped at the chance. I just want to say that, the process for us was very easy. Duke Energy reached out, basically handled everything for us, put us in touch with NovaCharge that provided the charging stations. Green Lots are the ones that handle the application for it. They set it up. Everything went very smoothly. We went live in early December, and for the time being, we are making this a complimentary charging station for our EV users. We've been seeing our usage increase dramatically over the last few weeks, and that's what we want to see. They come, they charge their cars. As soon as our chamber and our visitor center is fully open to the public, they will also have a place to come in and rest and relax, learn more about our county, go through our displays of tourist materials while their cars are being charged. So I'm just very thankful, as I say, to be a part of this and appreciate everyone that is on this webinar. I apologize, I do have to run. I have another commitment. And of course, you can see I'm sitting here in my car, not an EV, but it is a hybrid. But hopefully one of these days soon, I will also be in one of those EVs. So thank you. And I'll hope to catch up on this webinar on the recording at a later time.
Thank you, Ardith. We greatly appreciate your time. Thanks for making yourself available, even if it is in your car. That's the type of technology that we appreciate in Zoom, that we can do things wherever we are. So Ardith, thanks again for being on here and saying some really great welcoming remarks on behalf of your chamber. If you don't mind, we will plan to share your contact info in case anyone has any questions about the chargers at your chamber and or how those came to be placed at your chamber. So with that, I will now turn the time over to Dory Larson, who will be followed by Stan Cross, and then we'll hear from Matt Alford of Drive Electric Florida. Dory, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. Thank you to CIEC for inviting us and for getting this really important conversation going. So I am here representing Electrify the South. We're a program of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy that leverages research, advocacy, and outreach to accelerate the equitable transition to clean energy powered electric transportation across the Southeast. So I'm going to help get us level set on this EV conversation with some terms, vehicles, and charging information first. So next slide. So plug-in electric vehicles are a category of vehicles that include both plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, shown in blue, and battery electric vehicles, shown in green. So basically, it's any vehicle that has the ability to plug in and receive electricity as a fuel source. Next slide. Currently, there are, believe it or not, 66 models of plug-in hybrid and full battery electric passenger vehicles available for purchase in the US. And I'm sharing this great resource from Plug-in America. Their website's called PlugStar, so it allows you to search by lots of different filters, and I would invite you all to check that out. Next slide. Many people don't realize that there is an electric application for every class of trucks as well. So it's not just light duty. So there's classes of trucks 4 through 8. There's transit buses, delivery vans, everything you could imagine. And folks are also, I think, sometimes unaware of the extent that automakers are really leaning into EVs. So like Ryan mentioned, Ford has made a $32 billion investment. GM plans to release 30 new EVs globally by 2025 under a $27 billion investment in electric and autonomous vehicles during that time frame. Just yesterday, Volvo announced that they are going to go all electric by 2030. So there's just an explosion of action in this space. Next slide. Wanted to also give a quick overview of charging. So all electric vehicles come with a standard 120 volt charging cord. It's like a laptop or a cell phone that you can just plug right into your garage or your carport. Electric vehicles can also charge using a dedicated charging station that operates at a higher power, so at 240 volt. And you can install a 240 volt charging station either at a home or a business, and then you simply plug the car into the charging station. And there are thousands of 120 and 240 public charging stations all over the country. And there's a growing number of the even higher powered DC fast charging stations, like was just previously mentioned, how Citrus County has some of these DC fast charging stations in their parking area. Next slide, please. And just a quick mention on Tesla, because they really are really innovating the industry. They have their own proprietary charging station, and the outlet looks like the image there for all 3 levels. So the level 1, level 2, and their DC fast charging they call supercharging. And that's one of the stations that's shown in that image there. Next slide. So why would you choose to go electric? First and foremost, EVs are really fun to drive. The Tesla Model S in plaid mode that's shown here has a 0 to 60 time of 2.2 seconds. And that is the quickest production car in the world. Also, powering them is very convenient. They can be recharged at scheduled times overnight while you're sleeping. And the range really exceeds most driving needs. So EVs are a practical solution today. Plug-in hybrids can drive for 10 to 50 miles using electric only before they switch and use gasoline. And then they can drive for an additional 300 miles, depending on the size of the fuel tank, just like any other car. And the current average range for an all-electric vehicle is 286 miles on a charge. Though some EVs, like the Teslas, can exceed 350 miles on one charge. And like I mentioned, many automakers have announced plans to bring more electric vehicles, and those are promising longer range and even faster charging times. Next slide. So for businesses, the bottom dollar obviously is a very important factor when it comes to buying an electric vehicle. Many consumers like the idea, but may sometimes balk at the purchase price, which is typically higher. However, it's not as high as some people might think. The Kelley Blue Book average electric vehicle cost versus the industry average of an equivalent gasoline powered vehicle is only $4,000 higher. And that's without any of the purchase incentives that are available. Also, new research from Consumer Reports shows that when the total ownership costs are considered, so when you're including factors such as the purchase price, but also the fueling costs and the maintenance expenses, EVs come out ahead, especially in more affordable segments. Next slide. So people frequently ask about the cost to charge an electric vehicle or what it's going to do to their power bill. As you can see, it costs about $35 to $40 to drive about 1,000 miles, and gasoline costs are almost triple that. Next slide. So why else would a business want to go electric? There are many reasons that a company may be considering providing workplace charging for their employees. It could help to attract and retain forward-thinking employees. It could help enhance the company's green image. It could gain points towards LEED certification or to raise overall awareness for electric vehicles. So I've linked some great resources from the United States Department of Energy with sample policies. And I also wanted to point out that it doesn't need to be free. So employees can pay to participate so that it is just a win-win for employers and employees. Next slide, please. Another reason that businesses may want to go electric is to attract customers. So one study from UC Davis found more than half of the fast charger customers shop while they're charging. Some of those stop specifically to shop, and some shop because they're charging. The average dollars spent is $29.33 if the shopping is incidental, and $45.94 if the shopping is the reason for the trip. Next slide. Another reason that companies are choosing to go electric is being a good community partner. So EVs are able to reduce total vehicle emissions through using electricity instead of gasoline. In Florida, you would have to average 66 miles per gallon to get the same emissions benefits of driving electric. And with the increasing shift towards renewable energy generation, the US electricity grid is getting cleaner every year. With no tailpipe emissions, there is reduced exposure to our communities from air pollution, and EVs have the benefit of reducing racial health disparities associated with transportation pollution. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to touch on how local governments are encouraging EVs through public-private partnerships. An EV ready policy is one way that requires a percentage of parking spaces to be built to include the electrical infrastructure that would enable future EV charging. So it's not necessarily requiring that the charging stations be installed, rather that they can be placed in the future. It makes it a lot lower cost to do it that way. Another way that cities are helping to build out and encouraging electric vehicles are that they, some of them are offering rebates for the equipment and for labor costs associated with the installation of both public and private EV charging stations. So one program with Sarasota County is called the Charge Up program, and it allows local governments to direct businesses toward grant opportunities, which cover 50% of the EV charging station installation costs. And those funds come from pollution recovery fees. So next slide, please. So those are just some of the kind of things to be thinking about, and I wanted to, like I said, level set the conversation. I also wanted to share my contact information. Please feel free to reach out, and happy to take the conversation further. So next, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Stan Cross.
Thank you, Dory, and hello to everybody on the Zoom. Appreciate being here. I work with Dory Electrify the South in Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. I'm based out of Asheville, North Carolina, but work on policy and regulatory reform issues across the region Prior to joining the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I co-founded and led an EV charging infrastructure company based out of North Carolina that we launched in 2009. So I had the pleasure of installing some of the first fast charging stations, working on some of the first public-private partnerships with local governments to get charging stations on public property with private investment. And during my time working in that infrastructure space, learned a lot of lessons that I carry forward in the policy and regulatory reform work that I'm currently doing. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the market, starting nationally, then regionally, and then down into Florida to sort of ground us in the opportunity at hand. Southern Alliance for Clean Energy partners with Atlas Public Policy to track the electric transportation market Southeast wide, and then we do specific Florida state deep dives when the market warrants it. And we did one on Florida at the end of last year, because there's a lot of market traction in Florida right now and a lot of productive public policy and utility engagement that's beginning to happen that has the promise of really boosting the market in the Sunshine State. Next slide, please. So when we're tracking the market, you've heard already today about some of the sort of movement in the industry in terms of manufacturer investments and commitments. And one of the things that we're watching is the flow of capital, the flow of investments moving in this global economy. The goal being to attract as much of that investment to America to grow American jobs. And then from Florida's perspective, pull in as much of that American investment to Florida to do the same. And again, whether that's creating manufacturing jobs or whether that's setting the right sort of policy and regulatory framework that really boosts the market to create a lot of jobs in the installation of charging infrastructure, there's significant opportunity for Florida to capture in this massive investment that's going on around transportation electrification. Additionally, Florida sits in a unique position as being, one of the nation's premier tourist destinations. And so how Florida positions itself from a charging infrastructure perspective to meet the needs of Floridians can also be done to attract the growing number of EV drivers that are looking to take their electric vehicle on vacation. Next slide. So when we look at EV sales nationwide through 2020, there's a couple of things I want to point out. There's a lot of information on this graph, but what I want to particularly hone in on are a few things. One is the blue bars represent Tesla sales. So you can see how much Tesla is dominating the market, which gives you an indication as to why the other OEMs are investing heavily and making strong commitments, because they now have to catch up to Tesla's market dominance. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is the blue line on the top of the graph. That blue line is referencing the amount of penetration in the market. And that blue line represents just passenger vehicle sales. So if you look at automotive sales writ large, electric vehicles have passed the 2% market penetration mark in terms of new vehicles sold. But if you take out large pickup trucks and other vehicles for which there is not currently an electric vehicle comparison, I'm just focusing on passenger vehicles. At the end of 2020, electric vehicles crossed the 12% mark. So 12% of new car sales nationwide were electric. You can also see that in the fourth quarter of 2020, we tied our second strongest quarter of sales for EVs ever, which is really interesting when you consider the dip in Q2 that's related to the pandemic. So what electric vehicles are showing is that they're more resilient than automotive as a whole in rebounding from the economic crisis that we're experiencing. Next slide. When we look at Florida, there's a few specific indicators that we're tracking to see kind of how Florida is doing compared to other states nationwide and in the Southeast. Currently, when we look at passenger EV manufacturing and manufacturing investment, Florida is not capturing that sort of value stream of global investment dollars. We're only able to look at publicly available data, which really has us focusing on the passenger vehicle side of things. There's also movement in the medium and heavy duty space that would add some investment to Florida. And there's also a lot of supply chain companies that are servicing the industry and installers of infrastructure that are existing in Florida. And we're working to try and track that data better. But even with all that data adding up, Florida is not currently a strong state nationally or in the region in terms of manufacturing, employment, or investment. When we look at EV sales in Florida and EV charging deployment, there's two interesting phenomenon. One is that as far as its rank nationally in terms of gross EV sales and gross EV charging deployment, Florida ranks second. When we take in a per capita reality and apply population data to those numbers, Florida drops significantly. So on a per capita basis, Florida is sitting at about 18th in the country for EV sales and 30th in the country for EV charger deployment. There's a lot of room for market growth. There's also a lot of room for growth in utility investment and government funding. Currently, Florida is lagging in both categories compared to what's happening in other states. And what we're seeing nationwide is that the states that have strong utility engagement, which is often in the form of investment in EV charging infrastructure, as well as states that are allocating funding either through Volkswagen settlement dollars or other mechanisms to support the growth of the market, those states are where the market is strongest. Next slide, please. So this is another look at Florida EV sales. This only goes through the second quarter of 2020, so it doesn't include the last 2 quarters as the previous slide did. But what I want to point out in this slide is the difference between the blue bars and the green bars. The blue bars are your all electric vehicles. The green bars are your plug-in electric vehicles that use both a plug and gas. And what you can see is over time, plug-in electric battery vehicles are beginning to dominate the market. And as that happens, the need for charging infrastructure increases, because once you're dealing with all battery electric vehicles, those vehicles can only run on electricity. And so access to plugs becomes critical. Next slide. The other thing I want to point out is when we think about economic development, we can think about it in terms of job and workforce growth opportunities. We can also think about it in terms of tourism revenue. But another way to think about it is sort of the reduced cost of transportation for both consumers, drivers of EVs, as well as taxpayers as public fleets electrify, and then businesses as corporate fleets electrify. And those savings create, additional cash that can be used for other purposes in the economy. When you think about a state like Florida that doesn't have oil production or refining capabilities, so it's importing all the gas and diesel that currently goes into cars, trucks, and buses. When that gas and diesel is purchased, the majority of that money leaves the state of Florida and goes to oil-rich states and other countries. When we shift to electricity, you're now buying your fuel source from local providers, your utilities. And as more EVs hit the road, more electricity is consumed. And by buying it locally, you're enabling more dollars to flow through the Florida economy. Additionally, when you're buying more electricity through electrifying transportation, you're creating downward pressure on electric utility rates. So that added load is able to keep utility rates down, which then creates savings for everybody, EV drivers and non-drivers alike. There's a lot of economic development opportunities that will result from electrifying this sector. Next slide, please. This slide shows where the concentrations of electric vehicles are in Florida. The darker the green, the more EVs there are. And you can see that the concentration is around some of the larger metropolitan areas in the state. This is typical. We see the same pattern nationwide. and it's intuitive as well. But as we look to scale electric vehicle ownership and look at the policies and regulatory reforms that can help that scaling, it's important to keep in mind that we want to grow this market in an equitable and accessible manner so that all Floridians can benefit from the lower cost of ownership and improved public health benefits of electrified transportation. Next slide. And I'll just end with this slide, which has a picture of my electric vehicle. So I've also been an EV driver for the last 7 years. And I can attest to the fact that once you kick gas, there's no going back. It is a far superior driving experience. Plus I save about $1,300 a year driving this EV instead of the car that it replaced. And I can tell you that $1,300 does not show up in my savings account. It is being spent. And so I'm also seeing how those savings can really be a boost to the local economy when you think about it at scale. So with that, I'll turn it over to my good friend, Matt Alford from Drive Electric, Florida.
Thank you so much, Stan. It's a great group here, and it was very nice to hear the opening speaker mention Duke Energy, Green Lots, and NovaCharge. The three of them are all on Drive Electric Florida's board of directors. So I think that we're certainly, we have our thumb on the pulse, finger on the heartbeat, if you will, of many of the electrification efforts that are underway in the state of Florida. Next slide. So just a quick overview kind of the vision and mission for Drive Electric Florida. We're here to advance the energy, economic, and environmental security of the state of Florida by promoting the growth of electric vehicle ownership and its accompanying infrastructure. And I think Stan just laid out a laundry list of benefits for electrification in terms of economic and environmental security. And we're here to support and accelerate the adoption of plug-in electric vehicles in Florida by engaging and educating the public, businesses such as yourself, and policymakers, and facilitating collaboration and supporting EV-friendly policies and programs. Next slide. And so that's just a quick snapshot of our membership at present. As you can see, we have folks like Clean Cities Coalitions. We have, municipal utilities, Florida Power and Light, the Sierra Club, the Environmental Defense Fund, Duke Energy, TECO. Those types of organizations don't typically all get in the same membership tent, if you will. So that ought to be a pretty powerful indicator of where the transportation sector is going long term. And it's a great group of folks to work with. You'll also see the cleanenergy.org, that's Stan and Dory. So very blessed to have them involved. Next slide. This is what we do. Largely, we've been focused on policy development. We try to provide access to best practices and technical expertise for folks that are interested in kind of, exploring the opportunities that are available today. Guidance for corporate and fleet electrification. We work with the government and private sector stakeholders such as utilities, infrastructure companies, and folks like yourselves. We've briefly touched on the total cost of ownership, right? By delivering the same service at a lower cost, businesses are able to reduce operational expenses, maximize value for shareholders if you're publicly traded, or if you're a small or medium-sized business, you can shift revenues to other facets of your budget. Fleets particularly are a high growth near-term market segment, which means that through corporate procurement, you can accomplish at scale relatively rapidly what would take dozens of individual consumer decisions to accomplish, right? So if you're going to go and buy 12 electric vehicles for your fleet, that would literally take a dozen individual consumer choices. So, and as Dory and Stan outlined, we do a fair amount of advocacy and education. And the ultimate goal for all of this, right, is to maybe make ourselves a little bit obsolete, but we're here to foster expertise local to and familiar with Florida's unique challenges. Next slide, please. So we've covered a lot of this, right? We've seen some sustained growth in our EV purchases over the last several years with no coordinated policy ecosystem to facilitate the growth of this market. That has been driven largely by individual businesses and consumer choices. And until very recently, there have been some limited utility incentives. JEA and OUC, both members of Drive Electric Florida, more forward-thinking exceptions. Kissimmee Utility Authority and Brickell Energy down South Florida. They've also got some incentive programs in place. Really, though, the biggest leaps forward have happened in 2019 and 2020. Duke Energy has its Park and Plug program, which Citrus County briefly mentioned. They have a pending rate case for residential rates and DC fast charging deployment along corridors. That'll be very important to create sort of an essential network of statewide electrification infrastructure. And then Florida Power and Light, they've got their Evolution program, EV-olution. That should have been a capital V there, but so it goes. And they are looking to do this in their service territory as well. So a lot is happening in terms of investments by the private sector. And then, you know, on the public side, the Volkswagen settlement, there have been 2 phases of grants that have accepted applications. Phase 1 has been awarded already. And then we've also got some pretty significant investments by Florida's school districts to electrify their school bus fleets. And that makes a lot of sense in terms of the health of children that don't have to sit at a bus stop while the diesel fumes idle. I'm sure all of you remember that smell from childhood, and the leather seats. So yeah, next slide, please. Volkswagen settlement, man, I got a little bit ahead of myself there. That's the press conference with the governor. That goober in the background with the black mask on is myself. Phases 1 and 2 paired with private investment from Tesla. It's projected to increase the number of publicly available DC fast chargers by 50% from 2019 levels. And that's just at the end of 2020, right? So we're going to see kind of some sustained growth in the sector. School buses, right, moving at scale on that. Quite a few school districts, Southeast Florida, Central Florida, have put some applications in for that. And I think really the secret sauce, and since we're talking to chambers, I know that the businesses are very familiar with this, right? It's going to take private investment, private sector capital, plus like smart public policies. And that's going to be ultimately what leads to accelerated EV market deployments. Next slide, please. Yep, and we've been involved in the beginning of that. The very first, they awarded 27 segments. Our members, Drive Electric Florida's members, won the overwhelming, an overwhelming number of those. Phase 2, it's focused largely on I-10 and other segments of the state that are going to be relevant to where where the chambers that are involved today are located. Next slide, please. So at the statewide level, in 2020, we were instrumental, Drive Electric Florida and its members were instrumental in passing Senate Bill 7018, which really has given us a lot of momentum in terms of working with state agencies and stakeholders to start a very robust discussion about what it's going to take from where we're at today to kind of get where we're going to be in 15 years, right? If General Motors is going to be all electric by 2035 and Volvo is going to be all electric by 2030, where are folks going to charge, right? So outside of the home setting where a lot of charging takes place, right? Businesses that are kind of able to get ahead of that, add charging infrastructure, they're going to capture that value from those groups of consumers. But be that as it may, SB 7018 was the first bill that the governor signed after the pandemic started, right? So bills were passed, legislative session ended, he signed a few of them, and all of a sudden the world went into lockdown. Well, several months later, the very first bill that he signed after that was 7018. So that ought to give you an idea of the commitment, at least in the governor's office, to this. And it's really been the first comprehensive interagency effort to explore the implications of electrification of the transportation sector. And we included in that the Florida Department of Transportation, the Office of Energy, and the Florida Public Service Commission, which regulates utilities, as well as the Department of Emergency Management, so that we can help get a handle on exactly what it's going to take for evacuations. And the goals of it were to expand the use of electric vehicle chargers in the state, including charging stations deployments, and then strategies to develop partnerships between folks like yourselves, utilities, government, and the public to develop the market. Next slide, please. So we have really worked with FDOT to accomplish some of these things. We want to be able to support, right, like short range travel. That's folks that have to drive from their home to work to go pick up groceries and then back home if they're not able to charge at home for whatever reason, or work for whatever reason, making sure that there is some publicly available charging infrastructure there. Long range travel, right? You got to drive from Miami to Martin County or from Tampa all the way to the end of I-4 on the other side of the state. Want to make sure that you're able to do that. And then, you know, we really, I mean, if you think about transportation, tourism, and economic development in Florida, right, there needs to be some hurricane and disaster evacuation thinking that goes into this, right? I'm sure that all of us have seen the long lines of cars getting on the interstate to get out at a crawl. And then I think very relevant to the discussion today, right? Support EV fleet adoption, government fleet, state agency, municipal vehicles, transit and school buses, and then private fleets, right? We've got rental companies, freight, distribution, logistics. Drive Electric Florida and our members, and as part of our education and outreach efforts, we're gonna have an essential role in implementing those policies with the participation of folks just like you. Next slide, please. And so these have been sort of the spectrum of recommendations. This is an actual slide from a stakeholder meeting that FDOT had. So if you think about, you know, the incentives, the installation and incentives, fleet requirements, local and regional guidance, it's really going to take an all hands on deck approach, right? But I'm sure many of you are familiar with government planning processes. Sometimes they produce a report, it goes and sits on a shelf. This is one area where that's not going to be feasible, right? This is a very much a matter of when, not if. We're going to need to start getting Florida's businesses to sort of think about this for themselves. It's not going to be somebody else that does it, right? It's going to be you all if the manufacturers for medium and heavy duty vehicles really move sort of into the electric space. Next slide, please. Yeah, oh, there we go. Somehow have a blank thing on there, but that's okay. Challenges and opportunities. So a wide variety of stakeholders are going to need to be convened to address a wide variety of considerations, right? For chambers of commerce and individual businesses, the sooner the better, right? So we've got a state and federal policy ecosystem, right? And then some of that to some extent, right? You know, if we're looking at monetary policy, what have you, that will drive some of the high level macroeconomic trends. We've covered private investment and incentives. That next little empty bubble should have been public policy. And then your needs, right? What do you need and how do you sort of fit into the broader picture for investment incentives, and how do we use that input to develop policy? So next slide, please. And there you go. So there are quite a few resources out there, and Drive Electric Florida works with a ton of different national organizations to sort of put best practices and technical guidance in front of folks. So, you know, fleet electrification at scale, electric vehicles, you know, the whole deal. That's sort of what we do. That's the sweet spot for us. And then what do we need from a policy standpoint in order to achieve these things, and how do we get a clear sense of what your needs are, and then how do we sort of take all of those organic considerations and distill them down into a discrete set of policy actions. That's the magic of this. We've got a lot of different types of members in the same harness together. So once everybody gets on the same page, it's just a wonder to behold how attentive and engaged folks tend to be, because our message has credibility, because we've run it through businesses, we've run it through environmental organizations and utilities. Next slide, please. More of the same, you know, so truck deployments, electric fleets, you know, preparing to plug in your fleet, right? I mean, you know, you're out there, you know, I'm just some guy you've probably never heard of or met before. I'm telling you that it's important to consider this. Yeah, we can help you with it though. If you want to maximize the value for your shareholders, which you've got a fiduciary duty to consider, or if you just, you know, want to spend less on fuel, have consumers in your community spend less on fuel, spend less on maintenance, right? There are no fans or belts or thousands of moving parts in an EV. It is essentially a battery powered computer on wheels. So, you know, there's a ton of discrete benefits there as well. Next slide. And there you go. That's my email address. So feel free, shoot me an email. Any questions you have, any thoughts, concerns. You know, your competitor across the street is putting in some EV charging stations, and by God, you're not going to let them beat you to it. Give us a call. We'll see sort of what we can do to catch you up. Or if you want to be the person that starts first, feel free to let us know. We're here to help. Thank you very much. Turn it back over to Ryan.
Thank you, Dory, Stan, and Matt. We really appreciate you sharing great information and personal stories to better inform this group of chamber and economic development professionals about the benefits of electric vehicles and the support that's out there for deployment of infrastructure and fleet conversion. I heard a lot of really great things in there, most notably the fact that, for me at least, these were the most notable takeaways, that there's a lot of support out there. Utilities are firmly behind this, which is super important to this. Those that are in charge of electrification need to be an important player, and they are. The fact that EVs really do lead to a cheaper form of energy being passed along to the end user just means that we can ultimately provide more public transit. And the more public transit means less congestion on the roads, which is obviously a great thing for transportation and economic development. Lots of other great takeaways, but those were a few things that I heard. I'd now like to introduce Darren Cheatham, CICE's Florida Policy and Engagement Lead, to lead a question and answer period. He's also got a few legislative things that he wants to address. And I will now turn the time over to Darren.
Great, thank you, Ryan. Can you hear me okay? Great. So as the Florida Policy and Engagement Lead, I would be remiss to not mention that yesterday was the start of the 2021 legislative session, and we at CICE were keeping tabs of a couple of important EV-related bills that will be making their way through the legislative process. The first one is SB 140, which will actually create a electric vehicle fee to make up for some of the state loss in revenue from the fuel tax, which obviously does not apply to electric vehicles since they are not using fuel, they're using electricity. In addition to SB 140, we're also keeping our eyes on SB 138, which creates a statewide grant program for EV infrastructure for certain entities to install EV chargers. So that could be really key for chambers and their member businesses. Now, both bills have actually been sponsored by Senator Brandis, who Ardis brought up earlier, who was so instrumental in helping their chamber get EV chargers. And CIC will provide regular updates as these bills move through the legislative process. So with that said, I'd like to kick off the Q&A session with some of the questions that have come in through chat or via email. So first, I'd like to, this one I think, Matt, you might be the most appropriate to respond to. And that's, what's the easiest way for a chamber or a business to get involved with EVs? Now, for most of the chambers or businesses on the call, EVs aren't likely maybe a top 3 priority, and they have other issues pulling at their attention, but yet they want to do something and take advantage of the economic opportunity. So what do you recommend? Is it, buying an EV, or is it buying a public charger, or is it maybe just getting more involved in the legislative discussions going on at the state level?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think, as with any other task, right? The first step is to kind of, define your needs, right? What are your fleet? What are your operational needs? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to offer consumers an amenity that will mean they spend more time inside of your establishment shopping while their car charges than they would have if they had gone to a gas station to do the same thing, right? Are you trying to capture value in that way? Are you trying to electrify your fleets, right? How many EVs do you plan to deploy? What are their routes going to be? Do they travel specific routes? Can you work with partners to make sure that there is publicly available charging infrastructure in place? And then you're also really going to want to work with your utility. That's going to be absolutely crucial, because you're going to need to make sure that there's an adequate kind of supply of electricity if you're going to put a dozen cars in place and charge all of them. It's going to depend on what time you charge them. If you get off, your employees get off, they plug it in at 5 o'clock at the same time that everybody else is getting home, bumping down the AC in the summertime, opening the refrigerator, starting a load of laundry. That can get expensive for you, right? So work with your utility to pick the best rates, to make sure that your vehicles charge at the same time. Define kind of your outcome that you're most interested in, right? Again, is it for your own operations? Is it to boost revenues on the consumer spending side? And the folks that drive an EV, as Stan mentioned, right, they have an increased amount of purchasing power, right? The dollars that they save on fuel and maintenance circulate in the broader economy more rapidly, which is good for your business. And then, yeah, I think site design and planning, making sure you've applied for the permits, all that pesky and annoying stuff that you have to do anytime you want to make an improvement on your own property. And then after all of that, once you've kind of gotten the utility sign off, the permits have been pulled, you've designed where this is going to go, right? You've got a physical footprint for your business or for your fleet space. Then you're going to kind of want to, obtain the equipment, utilize any incentives that are available that are offered by your utility, and really get going, get cracking. So I think that those are kind of your biggest steps, right? Like define what you want, and then go get them. Great,
thank you, Matt. Very helpful. Another question that has come in, I think, Dory, this one might be ideal for you. So if you're a small business or a chamber that's located near public charging, whether that be DC fast, more than likely, you may still want to convert to EV, but you may not have quite the same incentive to install your own charger if there's a nearby publicly accessible charger. How would a business or a chamber find out if their office resides near available public charging? What resources out there for businesses and chambers?
That's a great question. So there's two resources that come to mind. One is from the Alternative Fuels Data Center, which is part of the U.S. Department of Energy. And I will put that link in the chat in just a minute. It is updated annually, and they do a real good job of maintaining the list of functioning charging stations. Another is called PlugShare, and that is a great app that you can get on your phone, and it shows where all of the charging locations are. It tells you if it's level 2 or if it's DC fast charging, and it's also crowdsourced. So folks will sometimes comment on it like, this charger is really fast, or this charger, the handle's broken, so that you are aware of the functionality of the unit itself. But I think that part of it is that people don't think that there is as much charging as there actually is out there, because they don't have the big signs like gas stations do. They're sometimes tucked away in a parking garage. So there's actually, I think if you check those two resources out, you will be surprised at how many charging units there currently are. Great.
Stan, I think this one might be targeted towards you. I think this is a great question. We've been talking about, businesses getting chargers, infrastructure in their parking lot. But if you share a parking lot with other businesses, or maybe you don't have a parking lot at all, how should you start that conversation with neighboring businesses, landlords, or even your city about having EV chargers installed? Is there any sort of how-to guide or organizations out there to help small, medium-sized businesses kind of get the wheels moving on that?
Yeah, there are resources, and we can provide some of that on the back end of the webinar. But I think really the beginning step is to understand kind of where you sit from the position you just explained, Darren. And so if you're a tenant in a building, and the decision making is really up to a landlord, versus if you're part of a number of businesses that make decisions democratically for what happens in the parking lot, that's obviously where you're going to start the conversation. And the critical part of that conversation, to make sure everyone's level set and understands, whether it's a charger on your property or whether you're advocating for chargers in your community or at local businesses is that the EVs go where the chargers are. And inside those EVs are consumers. And so the beautiful thing about electric transportation that's different than gas stations is because there's not hazardous liquid fuels and environmental regulations associated with deploying EV charging stations, you can put them where you want to drive business. And so that's really the big benefit to all this, because when a driver goes to an EV charging station, they become a captive consumer. They're going to be there for 30 minutes to 90 minutes getting that charge. And so if you bring people to commercial downtown districts where a lot of investments made to revitalize those districts, you're able to have them, support all the shop owners in that area. If you're bringing them to a strip mall, you're able to support the businesses there. If you're bringing them to your chamber, as was mentioned earlier in the webinar, you're able to capture that consumer and get eyes on the material that you created at your facility. So that's really I think where I'd start the conversation, because I think everybody can rally around wanting to have that value that the EV driver represents and that captive consumer capacity, on their property.
Great, thank you, Stan. I think we have time for maybe one or two quick questions. I'm going to try to speed this along. We've got so many, which is great. Matt, I think this one is aimed at you. Are there any federal tax incentives for commercial EV or EV charger customers? How about federal incentives for fleet conversion? If not, do we expect to see any under the new federal administration?
So I think in order, the answer would be yes, yes, no, yes. I think so. A lot to unpack there. Yes, there are tax incentives. They have been, I think, included in the COVID-19 stimulus package that's currently being debated. 30% for charging infrastructure. There are incentives for individual vehicle purchases, depending on which automaker you purchase them from. It's something called CAFE standards. Very complicated, but in essence, up to the 200,000 EVs that an automaker makes in sales, they get a tax benefit. I would anticipate that there will be sort of a CAFE standards 2.0 discussion that happens at the federal level for the surface transportation reauthorization bill that's going to need to be passed later this year. The House Representatives had $1.5 billion for EV charging infrastructure included. The Republican-controlled Senate last year had $1 billion. So there's certainly, I think, a bipartisan recognition at the federal level that investments are going to be necessary. And then, of course, the Biden administration is also committed to electrifying the federal fleets. So if you think about what that will do to the cost of batteries for manufacturing and economies of scale, reviewing and reshoring supply chains, I think General Motors earlier today announced that it's going to need to extend a production halt due to a lack of semiconductors. So I'd imagine that some of the Buy America provisions that we're seeing discussed at the federal level will have a very positive impact on American jobs and the American economy. So the last part of that question was, I don't remember, but that's an overview, I think.
Thank you, Matt. I think you covered it all. And just a final question before we wrap up the discussion. And Stan, maybe you might be good to cover this one. Can you speak to businesses that might be better suited for public EV chargers? Or are they ideal for all business? I'm talking more really about public EV charging here, not necessarily for fleet charging. For example, a hotel or a bed and breakfast might be ideal for a level 2 charger, whereas your local drugstore where you're kind of in and out, you might not get the same kind of usefulness from a level 2 charger. Can you kind of speak on that a little bit? What businesses might make more ideal chargers, locations for different types of chargers?
Absolutely. So first off, the what's known as the DC fast chargers are really expensive pieces of equipment, and so that's really regulated to highway corridors right now and not particularly relevant to, a typical business application. So when we're talking about public charging at businesses, we're primarily talking about level 2 chargers, which range in cost from $1,000 to $3,500 per cord, right? So a more reasonable investment when you're thinking about the return of bringing in those captive consumers. And so the ideal locations are really anywhere where you can make use of the captive consumer for 30 minutes or more. So supermarkets work really well. Commercial downtown districts work really well. Strip malls with multiple amenities work really well. Chambers of commerce work great. I've worked with our local Chamber of Commerce in Asheville, North Carolina. They've got a bank of charging stations deployed there. And so tourists come and plug in while they learn about the Asheville destination. Hotels and other overnight stay locations are great for EV charging. They're probably one of the most important when you think about it from a tourism perspective, so that the EV has that time overnight to charge. But there's really a wide range of applications. And, I think the key consideration, and there's a question in the chat about this, as to whether or not, you are providing it as an amenity, or you're trying to commodify the charger and create a revenue stream. So those are kind of the two kind of choices that every business makes. And for most businesses, it's an amenity. You give it away to customers to draw them in. But there's also a business proposition for charging drivers to use the chargers and creating a new source of revenue, such as if you're a gas station that's in the business of selling transportation fuel.
Great. Thank you, Stan. I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan to wrap us up.
Thanks, Darren. With that, it is time to wrap up. I'd like to say thank you to all of you for attending our webinar today. Thank you to our co-hosts, Drive Electric Florida, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and to our presenters for spending some good quality time with us today. You'll soon be able to view this webinar on our YouTube. We will most likely have it posted there within the next couple days. So please feel free to check that out, and we will send out any follow-up information via email to attendees. So again, thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you for any partnerships in the future when it comes to deploying more electric vehicles in the state of Florida. We look forward to working with you. Take care. Thank you.